Well, if you're listening in already, we're about to start a webinar on church culture. I'm going to give a few minutes for everybody to log on. Welcome. My name is Mark Bargher, and we have with us Jim Powell today. But let me just wait a few minutes, and we'll get started here in just a minute or two. There we go. Got our welcome message up. We'll give it one more minute. It looks like we've got a few of you online, so welcome. I can't see you on the screen, but we're sure glad you're here. And we've got a chat message up here from Jim. If all of you can open your chat, we're going to talk that way as we go through the webinar today. And love to have you. We posted a question there while you're waiting to start. Tell me where you're from. So any of you that want to put your name out there and tell us who you are, that would be great. Sylvia from Placerville, California, welcome. Glad to have you here. I'm not sure who the rest of you are here. I guess I could pull it up. Maybe I can see your names. Who knows? Got somebody putting a Q&A in. Glenn Lane, welcome. Glenn, we're using the chat feature. If you could jump over to that, it'd be great. That's why I don't have to have both these on the screen, but I'll put this over here and try and stay with you both. That is right down at the bottom of your screen. That's what we'll go with today. Thank you. I see your answer there, so thank you. And Glenn didn't put his church in, but I know he's out there in Fallbrook. Welcome. David Cook from Cold Springs here. Welcome, David. You're our farthest away, I think. Is that farther than... Oh, wait. Sylvia, Placerville, same place. Okay. So, welcome. And while the rest of you are logging in, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Mark Bargher. I'm the Church Health Lead, and I'm welcoming you to our webinar today. We are calling it Changing Church Culture. And we're going to talk today about what is church culture. We're going to define that, give you some ideas on how to diagnose what your culture is, and also provide some ways to work towards developing a healthier church culture. I have with me today Jim Powell, who's written a book. If you haven't seen this, let's see if I can get it in focus. Dirt Matters, maybe. I know, let's see, get it next to your face? No, it's not going to. Well, Dirt Matters was written by Jim a few years ago. He calls this the foundation for a healthy, vibrant, and effective congregation. This is a great book. And when I read this, Jim was not on our team, but in it he explains and illustrates the importance of church culture and kind of connects it with an analogy from the Bible we're going to talk through today, so I won't tell you anything more about it. Jim is today a pastor at one of our TM churches out in the Phoenix area, out in, where is that again, Jim? Is that Sun
City
West?
West.
There it is.
City West.
There it is, thank you. And that's Palm West, and he's been there, you've been there now 3 years, Jim?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. So one of our successful placements from our church health team, and Jim came from a background out at Richwood's Christian Church in Peoria, Illinois. He also started a team called 95 Network, which was all about helping churches be healthy, and this was for small churches. And yeah, I know he's turned that organization over to a friend of mine, Dale Sellers, doing a great job with it. But Jim is here today to talk about church culture. So I hope you're everybody on the same page, or everybody come to hear that today?
Yeah.
Without hearing any no's, I'm going to go forward. When I was in school, all of you remember MDiv? You studied Reinhold Niebuhr? Was it? There
Niebuhr.
it is. That was my favorite author, because I can't say his name, but that's when I first kind of got a little taste of what culture really is, and it's a much broader sense in Reinhold's words of our world. And then later on, read a great book. I don't know if you've read this book called Culture Making by Andy Crouch. You also can't see that. He calls it Recovering Our Creative Calling, that every Christian is called not to condemn culture or critique culture, even to copy culture, or consume it, but actually change culture and create culture. And if we look back at our church 100 years ago, that's what church was about. We really were the culture. Today, we're on the outside, but we can create culture within our families, within our church, and in the broader sense, the world culture, we can be an influence to that, not just to consume it. So we'll be talking specifically about culture inside the church today. Jim, I want to say welcome to you. Thank you for being here today. As we get started, you have any words of wisdom about your book or where we're heading before we get started?
No, just that culture is very, very important. And I think it's very underemphasized as pastors and church leaders. Oftentimes our focus is on methodology programs. We look for, we're constantly looking for the silver bullet or the secret sauce, right?
Yes.
Let's change the name of our church. Let's put a new sign up. And while those programmatic or sort of promotional type pieces, those things can matter. The reality is if you don't have a healthy culture, it's not going to change anything, because every time you and I walk into a facility, we can walk into a Walmart, you can walk into a doctor's office, and subconsciously we're always sort of picking up signs of culture. And when you walk into some place and it smells funky, like something just feels off or smells off, that's culture. And when people walk into our churches and they don't feel welcome, they don't feel greeted, they don't feel loved, everything from the way we talk to the way the greeters are to the way our building looks, the quality of our parking, all those different things are sending messages to people. And as you know, Mark, I'm sorry. As you know, the people often make a decision within the first couple of minutes whether they're going to return to a church. George Barnes
1 to 3 minutes,
done research on this. And so why are they making decisions that quickly? Because the culture, the vibe they're picking up, is causing them to make value judgments before they've ever heard the sermon preached. In many cases, before they've ever heard the first song or not. They've already said, hey, I sort of like this place. I might want to come back. Or you know what? I just got to finish my 60 minutes so I can go home here and look for something else.
Yeah, I know sometimes the decision made is in the parking lot. They feel welcome or unwelcome, by where they have to park or somebody that says hello. And of course, when we do look at churches, one of the things that's the biggest, methodologies of reasons people don't come back to church is because they don't feel welcome and because the bathroom stinks. And you go, what? The bathroom? And that strategically has to be something that we pay attention to. Otherwise, people, before they ever get into our services, they say, there's something stinky about this place. I don't want to be part of it. And part of that, they might be sensing the culture. They sense that you're not staying even up, keeping your bathrooms smelling good. So the rest of the place kind of casts a shadow on the whole place. But we know that culture is really important. I remember in a class in college, I studied a little bit under Peter Drucker and some of his books, father of kind of organizational management. He's passed away now, was a great Christian. And what he said about culture was this, that culture eats strategic planning and all strategic things for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I've heard it quoted different ways. That all the strategic things that we try and figure out and methodologies, boy, if we don't have our culture right, it makes such a difference that people just won't hear us. In fact, I was sharing with you earlier, Jim, that in my first 25 years in the business world, I worked with Steve Jobs at Apple, and Bill Gates was opening this little place called Microsoft. Everybody wanted to work there because their culture was so open. And we'll find the same thing about Google and some of these .coms today. I wonder what people say about our churches, though. Do they want to work there? Do they want to come there? Is it inviting? So maybe we should start today with just kind of defining what church culture is. Could you help us with that, Jim?
Yeah. So culture is the sort of the composite of attitudes, of beliefs, of characteristics, the overall environment of an organization. And so the word culture actually comes from the word agriculture. And so agriculture, speaks about the environment, and so culture is sort of a sub environment you have within every business, every community, every church has a subculture. They have a culture and environment there. And it's made up, once again, of beliefs, of assumptions, of attitudes, characteristics, etc. And oftentimes what makes culture very difficult is that it's not easy to diagnose or to define. It's somewhat nebulous.
Yeah.
It's not nearly as tangible as saying, this is a brick building, right? This is a whatever. It's harder to define. But as I said earlier, everything about our church is sending subconscious messages to people they're picking up. And let me just give you a story to illustrate this. In my previous church, I was talking about this to a group of people. And this lady raised her hand and she said, she goes, can I just tell you our experience? We relocated due to my husband's job. And they had visited like 12 or 13 churches. Like every weekend they'd gone to a different church. And she said, we got to the place where we knew what to expect before we ever walked into the building. And I said, well, explain that, flesh that out. What do you mean by that? She says, well, it started by the cars in the parking lot. If you see a lot of vans, minivans, SUVs, what does that communicate? Obviously, families or children. Yeah. You pull in and you see mostly, Toyota Camrys, right, and Buicks. It may be a little bit of an older clientele, right? If you pull in the parking lot, a lot of the cars are beat up and you've got broken fenders, or there's a lot of BMWs. You understand, looking at the cars in the parking lot communicates something. As they pulled their car in, she said, we would watch how people were dressed. Were people carrying Bibles or were they not carrying Bibles? Were they dressed very nicely? Were they dressed casually? All those things. And she gave more examples about, they sort of had an idea after visiting 12 or 13 churches in about 4 months. They had the idea that they were able to sort of make assumptions about what they were going to experience before they ever experienced it.
Oh, sure.
And so every church has a culture, but it is somewhat nebulous. To define and to tangibly put a clear definition on, but all of us are picking up these messages based upon the beliefs in our church, based upon the attitudes of our church. Are we really friendly or not friendly? Most churches that are struggling define themselves as friendly. And Mark, the churches you've worked with, almost every church that you and I go into to talk to that's struggling, we say, well, tell us about your church. And they say, well, we're a friendly church.
Yeah. They always say that.
And my follow-up question always is this, okay, what do visitors or guests say about your church? Do they say it's friendly?
Right.
And invariably someone's sort of like, well, I invited a couple of people. They said we weren't very friendly, but that's not really true, right? Yeah. Because sometimes we can be friendly to our own people, but we think you simply say, well, hi to somebody, and then we stand with our back to them that we're still friendly. When sometimes the guests that are coming to our church don't feel that way.
Yeah. Jim, sometimes it's even more obvious. I do a secret shopper at some of our churches. And one church I went into, I sat in a seat and a lady came in and said, "You're in my seat."
Yes, exactly right.
I mean, immediately my reaction was, this is welcoming? She forced me to get out of my seat because that was her place. And so we see just the opposite sometimes in churches that say they're friendly.
And that's, Mark, and that speaks to culture so importantly, because here's the thing. The senior pastor can be a tremendous man of God. He can preach a dynamic, anointed message. You can have the best worship leader in the world. You can have a dynamic children's program. But that kind of experience where someone says, you're in my seat, to some people, that clicks something that says, hey, I'm not welcome. I'm not coming back here. I'm not welcome. And you cannot overcome those kinds of experiences. And so your culture in many ways is affected by your worst people. Because you have a couple of toxic people in your church, it can be contagious to the whole thing. People can sense the tension of people that don't talk, or people that are sort of looking sideways to other people. You know what I'm saying? All those things come to the surface. Jesus never prayed for church growth, but he did pray for church unity.
Yes.
And when the church is unified, when the church is unified and you have a healthy environment, that is attractional to people. You don't have to send out flyers. You don't have to promote on the radio. People will show up to a healthy culture. And likewise, you can have great theology. You can have some great people at the top. But when you have an unhealthy culture, it's very, very difficult to overcome that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important to remember. Yeah. Now, as we talk about culture, I just want to help us with defining it. Is the culture also what's happening inside the staff? Like, is the staff culture? Is that what we're going to talk about today? Or are we more talking about the culture of the church in general? Or are those two connected?
Well, I'm open. I think, we've got a small number of participants. The good thing about this is we have time to interact. So, if David, Glenn, Peter, or Sylvia want to, shoot some questions, we can. I'm talking primarily today about the culture of our church as it pertains to our guests, our visitors,
Sure.
the congregation as a whole. But yes, staff has a completely different culture to it, because
Yeah.
if you don't, one of the phrases I tell people all the time is that if you're cracked at the top, you're split at the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so if your church board, if your leadership team, if your staff, if there's tension there, or there's like some awkward, some funky stuff going on among your leaders, that rift gets bigger and bigger the further you get into the congregation.
Yep.
Yeah.
So those
so
are all
you
connected.
They're all connected, and you have to take those things seriously. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, help us understand this idea of culture. Is there some biblical connection that we can kind of relate back to this idea of culture?
Yeah. Well, so when my book I entitled Dirt Matters, when I wrote it about 8 years ago, because one day as I was dealing with this idea of culture in the church I was pastoring, and one day I was reading the parable of the sower, and sort of the light bulb went off to me. And not just the parable of the sower, but I also had my grandparents were farmers in the Midwest. And in a very short period of time, one of my uncles died, and my grandparents had died. And I had a great uncle who had a tremendous piece of land. It was had a lake on it, had some woods where they would do a lot of hunting on that land. They had some farmland there where people would farm. And then my grandparents, they had some land as well. They had several hundred acres, but it was just flat, boring land, And when my great uncle, his name was Grover, when he died, I made the comment, his land is worth so much more than my grandparents. And I had another relative who was a realtor and a licensed appraiser. And he goes, Jim, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, Grover's land is like, you can fish on it, you can hunt, it's got, they farm on it. I said, it's worth so much more than my grandparents' land. He says, Jim, no, it's not. Because your grandparents' land is made up of Class A soil, where your great uncle Grover's land is a very poor quality soil. And he goes, you know what? Your grandparents' land will produce twice the harvest as your uncle's soil. And immediately I thought of the parable of the sower, because you see, as a city boy looking on the outside, the land that I thought was the most valuable actually was not very good at producing fruit.
Yeah.
Because what it was is that there was a culture, there was a health underneath the surface that made a difference in the harvest, right? And the same thing happens in our churches. And Jesus basically said it. He goes, listen, the key is not how you plant the seed. It's not if you use one hand or two hands or you do a machine. He said the key to a good harvest is not how you plant the seed. The key is a healthy environment, healthy soil.
So you would call our church culture the soil.
It is the soil in which the word of God flourishes and grows. And it's why you can have two churches, Mark. You can have two churches that have similar theology, similar philosophy of ministry, and one is booming and one is barely treading water.
Yeah.
Because in many cases, if you go into those churches and you evaluate, you're going to see the difference is not what they believe. It's not what they're preaching, the quality. In many cases, there's these funky dynamics where the environment of the church, the culture of the church is not as healthy. And when the culture is not healthy, just like Jesus said, the weeds can choke it out. The sun can burn it off, right?
Right.
If the culture is not healthy, it's not going to produce as much fruit.
All right. Well, that makes sense as that connection from culture. Now, why should our church leaders even care about culture or consider the topic of culture in your mind? We talked a little bit about it from a staffing and board standpoint, but what's the importance there for us to really kind of key in on it? Besides the quote I said that Peter Drucker says, it'll take everything else out if you don't consider it.
Let me give you an example. When my kids were little, my wife, we had to, you have to take your kids to dental stuff. They got to have, dental things before they go to school, everything. My wife took our two young kids to the dentist. And And so we ask around, we got the name of a dentist. She goes to the dentist. Now, my wife has got an illness, and at the time she had a walker, right? She had to use a walker. She's now basically using a wheelchair, but she was using a walker. So she comes in, she has her two kids. They were probably about 8 and 4, 9 and 5 at the time. She has her walker. She comes into this dentist's office, and the music is so soft, you can't hardly hear it. Mm-hmm. It has like hard tile floors, so you can hear her walker going across the bricks or the tile, you know, where the cracks are. Click, 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 right? Yeah. And so there's like, the music is not loud enough. You know, it's very, very, very quiet, very noisy as far as going across with a walker. Mm-hmm. She walks in, she goes, "Hello, my name's Stephanie. I have an appointment for my son." The secretary doesn't even pick her head up and make eye contact. Just says, "Well, fill this out." Hands her a clipboard to fill out. There were some other things that happened in the visit. Bottom line is, she goes back, she meets the dentist. She comes home, she goes, "I'm never going back to that place again." She goes, "You know what? The secretary was unfriendly." Mm-hmm. She goes, "The environment was sterile. It was just sterile and boring." And she goes, "To be honest," she goes, "I just felt completely embarrassed, you know, I felt like everyone was looking at me because my wheelchair or my walker's making so much noise going across the floor." And I said, "Well, how was the dentist?" She goes, "Oh, the dentist was great. I mean, he was great with the kids. I love the dentist, but I'm not going back."
Right, right.
This is why culture is so important for our churches. Yeah. Because as Jesus said, he said the key to a successful harvest, and Jesus is the one who made this connection. If you don't have a healthy environment, if you don't have healthy soil, you're going to limit what can grow out of that. And the culture is the soil in which our ministry takes place. And much like my wife going to the dentist, if people roll up to our church and they don't see a welcoming environment, they don't see clear signage to know where to go or what to do, they're not properly greeted, they don't know what's going on, we talk in code, they have these negative experiences. Like you talked about things like the bathroom, right? All these things send messages to people. What's happening is that you can be prepared, you can pray all week, you can prepare a great sermon, but people have already made up their mind they're not coming back before you ever get a chance to communicate God's word. And it's all because of the environment, the culture of our church. Yeah. So if you don't pay attention to this, let me give you some other examples. Some of our churches have greeters that are unfriendly people.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, Mark, you and I have been to a church. You see a greeter, like, looks like they're like, you know, they're all serious. They don't smile. They don't talk to you. They don't engage you. Just sort of stick a bulletin in your face. Yeah. The other extreme is, you ever been to a church with a creepy greeter? Like one that's like, you know, maybe a little bit too friendly, right? You know, you're like a little bit awkward. Yeah. Well, here's what happens. In most of our churches, we know that Jim is a little creepy, right? Jim, you know, maybe goes over the top too much. Or we know that Mark is not very friendly and not the best greeter in the world. But what happens in many of our churches is that we put up with it because Mark's family and Jim's family. Right. So we just put up with this person that's not serving in their gifts or maybe has some unhealthy behaviors. The problem is, when I visit your church, I don't know Jim and I don't know Mark. It's creepy. Yeah. Yeah. It's unwelcoming. My first church I pastored was a small rural church, 35, 40 people. We would get people who would sing special music, and some of them were bad. They were really, really bad. And you know what would happen after they sang their special music that was so bad? Everyone would clap. Yeah. Like, oh, what a great job. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that except this. If you're a visitor in that church and you hear someone singing and it's painfully bad, and then everyone claps, you're thinking to yourself, is it just me? Right? Is it just me, or what's going on here? Yeah, yeah. All of these things are messages that we're sending to people. And we may think they're not that important, but they really limit our church's potential, and they limit the ability of God, the word of God, to produce fruit. Right. It's like Jesus said, planting on rocky soil. Yeah. It's like planting on hard ground. We're sincere. We're trying to plant the seed, but it's not bearing any fruit. And many times it's because of these elements of culture and environment that limit and hinder what God can do in our church.
Oh, yeah, that's so real. I mean, we've all been in churches where the greeters are like that, or like a seat that you don't get, or you say, where is the person? I don't know anything about how to get where. I'm not leaving my kids somewhere. There's no signage. I don't even know where they're supposed to go. I'm not trusting them with these people. You know.
Starting the service 7 minutes late.
Oh, yes.
No communication about what's happening with the kids.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a church one time. I know you have stories like this as well, Mark. I went to a
Mm-hmm.
church one time. I said, Jim, tell you, I'm going through, tell us what you see. I'm going around. I say, where's your kids program? They go, oh, down here. And I look, and I'm not exaggerating. It was a
Yeah.
single story church.
Right.
And they had this stairway that went straight downstairs, and it was
Right.
not well lit. And
Right.
it went down to a dead end to a
Yeah.
hallway, and you had to turn left.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you send your kids down there? Like, oh, yeah, that's where all the kids go. And it was not well lit. It was dark. I'm like, as a parent of a guest, there's no way I would send my kids down there. It looked like something you see in a movie, right? Where an axe murderer is going to come out or something. Those things
Exactly.
we tend to not take seriously, but guests and visitors pick them up.
Oh, yeah.
And it sends negative vibes that limit our ability to minister to them with the word of God.
Yeah, I think I was telling you this morning the opposite. It was a stairway up, and on the way up, the kids would go up, and there was a glass window that was broken, and you could just imagine, how kids push each other, and somebody get pushed into that, how that would decapitate a kid or something.
Right.
Going, that's the first thing they see while they're walking up to the children's program. Then when they get up there, before they get to the children's class, there is a silver platter with a silver knife on it right outside the children's room. It was on display. Fantastic, but I could just imagine. Well, I had 3 boys. They would all picked it up and probably, use that to chase people down the hall with it. I don't know, but they see the danger, and we put up with it. I mean, we say, oh, that's not a big deal. Because we see it every day. Oh, we know the family, and that meant something, or
Yes.
we can't afford to fix but that makes an impression that basically blocks a
Yes.
relationship to start. It's like the first 3 minutes that you shake hands with somebody. We know that in less than 3 minutes, everybody makes an impression by your handshake, by how you're welcomed or not. And that happens in a church as well, starting in the parking lot, or even starting online before you get there and seeing a website and going, oh my gosh, these people are so backwards on their website. Why would I go there? So all that's
Here's
so important in reflecting culture. You're right.
another example that everybody on this webinar can relate to.
Yeah.
I think all of us have probably put a house up for sale at least once.
Oh, yeah.
What happens when you live in a house more than a few years? Pretty soon, the ding in the wall, the light socket that doesn't work,
Yeah.
we have all the door that squeaks. There's all this stuff that we're like, oh, I need to fix this. And then we just sort of let it go. And after a while,
Yeah.
we don't even notice it anymore.
Yeah.
But when we have the entire family come over for Thanksgiving,
Mm-hmm.
or we put our house up for sale, all of a sudden we start noticing all the stuff that had no longer, we become numb to it, right?
Yeah.
That hole in the wall now all of a sudden becomes a big deal. I've got to get that patched and fixed before I put my house up for sale, or
Right.
before we have everybody here for Christmas.
Right.
The door that squeaks, the toilet that you got to rattle to flush, all those small things that we live with, we do it in our individual lives, because when it's our home, we just sort of, we stop seeing it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when we invite other people into our home, we put up for sale, all of a sudden with these fresh eyes, we're like, I've got to fix this. I've got to fix that. Or the
Yeah.
realtor will point
Right.
out and say, you need to fix this or fix that. The
Right.
same thing with our church. And as you said, Mark, sometimes we get so comfortable with our church that we no longer are able to see it through the eyes of guests.
Yeah.
And then we wonder why our guests don't come back.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the reasons that our church health advocate team, we always say we're an extra set of eyes. We come in, we don't know, and we look for specific things. We have a whole checklist for hospitality, welcoming, and all that. But beyond that, Jim, tell us, if I'm a church leader, how do I evaluate, realistically what the culture is inside the church? How would I do that?
There's two big, there's a lot that can go in this. You can take culture surveys, different things like that. But here's the thing. Main thing is you want to evaluate through internal eyes and through external eyes. So what I suggest is get some of your leaders. And the best example to do an internal evaluation I've ever come across it's because it's such a powerful word picture, is by a man named Sam Chand. And Sam Chand wrote a book on culture, and he gave sort of the illustration of a car. and he gave 5 kinds of cultures as a general language. And I'm
Mm.
just going to read these to you. And if you're taking notes, you want to write these down.
Mm.
But just ask yourself, how would we describe the culture of our church? And here's some things he uses. The first one is an inspiring culture. Inspiring culture is like a car at the Indianapolis 500, which was just last weekend. An inspiring culture, you're full speed ahead. There's very few potholes. You're just flying around the track. Boom, boom, boom. You know, there's no problems. People believe what you're doing. There's a sense of purpose. There's high morale, high expectations. Failure is not fatal. Oh, it didn't work. We'll try something else, right? People don't get caught up and they don't major in minors. Leaders are not afraid to confront people. You have a very relational, culture. There's a high sense of acceptance of people while being true to God's word. You celebrate success, etc. That's an inspiring culture.
Mm-hmm.
An accepting culture is the second kind of culture. And the accepting culture is where you have a smooth track, almost like an interstate. But every once in a while, you have to slow down because you've got some road construction or you've got some potholes, right? Yeah. The road gets a little bumpy. We just got to slow down. Maybe there's a couple lane closures here. So you're able to open up and you're able to run 65, Mark, in your case, 82 or 83, right? You're flying down the road, but every once in a while, you still got to hit the brakes and deal with some stuff, right?
Yeah.
The overall, in an accepting church culture, the overall environment is positive. There are pockets of individual people or maybe families or departments that are maybe a little bit off, but the overall morale, the overall culture of the church is healthy. You have good communication. There's very few turf wars. Most people are motivated and dialed in, etc. That's an accepting church culture.
Okay, good.
The third church culture is what we call a stagnant church culture. Now, this is where you're driving on maybe a blacktop. Anybody ever I don't know if anybody here can relate to being in the country a little bit, but maybe a blacktop. Here you've got some ruts, some holes. Maybe you've got some blind turns. You don't know exactly where you're going around the head, over the hill. So you really can't open up. You're not running 80 on these roads, right? For the most part, you're a little bit more cautious. You're slowing down a little bit here and there. It's more suited for a pickup than it is a race car, right? You're not just flying around.
You got some bumps in the road.
Utilitarian,
you're
right?
You're going to hit them. Yeah.
Right. Cars move more slowly to avoid damage. In these kind of churches, there's more of a sense we tolerate people in situations. We tend to get a little momentum and then we tend to stop, right? It is every time we think we're over the hump, all of a sudden something new pops up that's really should not be a big deal that becomes a big deal.
Okay.
You start to see turf wars. Who got in the kitchen? Someone got in the refrigerator, right?
Yeah.
Because Lord forbid that our youth group on Wednesday night put some stuff in the refrigerator or took some things out they shouldn't have, because the kitchen is my domain. No one comes in the kitchen without my permission.
Yeah.
Someone was in my classroom and they didn't put the chairs back properly.
Yeah, those are mine because our class paid for them too.
Our class paid for it. So you start to see these kind of really trivial matters. This is my room. This is my department. This is my whiteboard.
Yeah.
And it's not terminal, but it's just tense, right? Because people are sort of, there's more complaining among leaders. You talked earlier, there's a little bit more tension between staff or between church board members. You find that people are clock watchers. You start to see, hey, all right, I'm going to show up to the fellowship dinner, but when's this going to be over with? Or I'm going to show up to the service or Sunday school, but when's this going to be over with? So people are faithful, but they're not really as excited. Not as many people are inviting their friends or guests because of, for whatever reasons. There's a lack of responsibility. People are more about blaming other people for things not working than saying, hey, I'm part of the problem here.
Yeah.
The fourth culture, and now we start to get into the dysfunctional cultures, is discouraging culture. This is like a car that's trying to go through a dirt road in the mud, right?
Oh, okay.
You're putting your accelerator down, but the tires are spinning. You're making progress or going through a snowy road, right?
Yeah.
It's very slow moving. You're putting a lot of energy, a lot of effort, but you're not making a lot of progress.
And it's messy.
It's messy.
Yeah.
Tires spinning this way, that way. You're giving it gas, but you just can't really get the car moving. In this kind of a culture, you have a number of very faithful people, but there's a lot of hurt feelings, a lot of anger, a lot of confusion. I was in a church one time that I was helping consult where they had, listen, this is a true story. They had 2 women that had not talked to each other in over a decade.
Yeah. Yeah.
A church of 200 people that had two people who came to every service that would not talk to each other.
Oh my.
That's a discouraging culture where it's just unhealthy. There's this kind of things, these kind of
Yes.
tensions, unresolved conflicts and problems. There's
Uh,
power struggles. People are in silos. I'm
uh,
with my group of people. You're with your group of people. We're not on the same
yeah.
team. It's more
Yeah.
about, fighting over power. In these kind of churches, people can, you can't get anything done,
Yeah.
right? Because you've got to jump through all these hoops.
Yep.
People can smell that this is not a healthy environment in this kind of a church. And
Constantly
the
putting
fifth
out
one is,
fires or changing tires.
yeah, right, exactly right.
Yeah.
The fifth kind of
Uh,
culture is what Sam Chan calls as toxic. And this is really a car that's, it's not moving, or it's going towards a washed out bridge.
yeah.
The staff is not motivated, leadership is closed, bad communication, etc. Now, that's language that you can use, and there's a lot more I could say about that, but that's language you can use to talk about your culture.
Yeah.
How do you view our culture among your leaders? Do you think we're inspiring? Do you think we're accepting? Do you think we're stagnant? Do you think we're discouraging? Or do you think we're toxic? And why do you feel that way?
Yeah.
And everyone shares, and you sort of make a vow of confidentiality and trust, and say,
Right.
I think our church is stagnant. Here's why.
Mm.
Or I think our church is discouraging. Here's why. It gives you some language to be able to talk through and to see where everyone is. But here's the
Wow.
second thing, Mark.
Yeah.
Somebody that has good people skills
Oh.
has to have enough courage to start following up on visitors and guests and ask them to speak reality. Is it Max Dupree who says the number one rule of a leader is to define reality?
Yep. Absolutely.
Define reality. And we have to be able to engage some of our guests and say, tell me what you really felt. Tell me what you really think. Be honest with me. Because
Yeah.
they see things that you don't see. And as I told you earlier, Mark, you've had the same experience. Go to a church that's struggling. Tell me about your church. We're very friendly. Well, is that what visitors say? Well, not really, but we have
Yeah.
to be able to listen to what they're saying and what they're observing. My last church I was at, we started at 65 people. We had a small building. We had our parking lot. That part of our parking lot, when you pull in the parking lot, was in a little bit of a lull, and whenever it would rain, the water would wash across there. So the parking lot had a lot of potholes in one part of it. And when I was following up with some guests and visitors, I said, tell me honestly, tell me critically what you saw about our church, good, bad, and different.
Yes.
And I just sort of noticed this theme where several people were saying, your parking lot is really bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, to me, it's not that big of a deal. I'm just going to save the money, drive around the potholes, because the rest of the parking lot's nice, right?
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
But these guests, it was a first impression.
Sure.
And so you've got to be able to listen. When I went to the same church early on, we had a tradition of allowing lay people to do communion meditations. And we had some people who did communion meditations that were just not very good.
Mm-hmm.
They were wonderful people of God, but they were not good communicators.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget this. We took a couple out for lunch after church one time, and they said, that poor guy who did communion today, is that the first time he's done it?
Yeah.
He'd
And
been
it
doing
wasn't.
it for 3 decades.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I mean, but once again, we put up with those things when it's church family, and it's just,
Yeah.
but guests and visitors see these things. So to evaluate your culture, use some language, talk through, like I said, the race car analogy, the 5 cultures is a great way to do it.
Yeah.
Have some conversation. Why do you think we're stagnant? Why do you think we're discouraging?
Yeah.
And talk about the things that you think are hindering your culture.
Yeah.
And then you've got to begin to survey, write down 5 to 10 questions to ask your guests confidentially and say, what did you experience? What was good about our church? What was troubling to you? What were your first impressions, positive and negatively? Ask them those kinds of questions to see what they say. And then this is most important, Mark.
Yeah.
Listen to what they say.
Listen to what they say. Yes. Yeah.
Don't argue with it. Don't justify it.
Yeah.
Listen to what they say.
Absolutely. Well, and that's what you said. You had to start with somebody who's a good listener, who has good rapport and skills with people, and can help basically define reality. So that, are they also explaining why there is potholes? Maybe
Right.
saying, hey, I know you came here as your first time. We have a project. We're going to fix those potholes. We realize it's a problem, but we want your experience to be great, and we're on that, and we
Yeah.
understand it. So if they bring it up or they don't bring it up, you're kind of defining reality. Is that part of that person's job?
100%. And you can't listen, you can't correct everything and you can't
Oh,
control
yeah.
every person in the church.
Yeah.
So, and like I said, this is not about head hunting or going after people or trying to, it's just about trying to define reality.
Yeah.
And so sometimes when we define a reality, though, it does mean that sometimes we have to confront things.
Yes.
And like I said, too often there's certain things that we have in our culture, and it may be, like I said, with the parking lot, it may be with our physical building. The
Yeah.
grass is not mowed
Right.
regularly, or it's not
Right.
trimmed. It's a bad look. Our
Uh-huh.
sign is outdated. We have, sermon topics for the last 2 weeks, 2 weeks ago, but it's not updated.
Right.
All those small things communicate messages.
Yeah.
But the hard part of culture is what happens when you have people
Yes.
that are hindering your culture.
Mm-hmm.
The greeter who's not shouldn't be greeting,
Mm-hmm.
the children's worker who's more concerned about the kids sitting down and behaving
Mm.
than really excited about giving the kids a positive experience. Because you
Yeah.
know what? Parents do not bring children to church.
Yeah.
Children bring parents to church.
It's exactly
And
right.
you've got to give children a great environment with energy and excitement. Well, if you have, the proverbial nun with the ruler, right?
Uh-huh.
And we're
Yeah.
worried about smacking knuckles, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Um, and so, when you have people that are part of your culture problem,
Yeah.
sometimes you just got to confront it. You've got to have a loving conversation and say,
Right.
listen, I'm not sure this is the best place for ministry for you to serve.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if we can redirect you and get you doing something else. Mark, when I was at Richwoods,
Mm-hmm.
we had a lady who worked in our kitchen. Her name was Joanne.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to tell you what, when we had church dinners, dude, they were awesome.
Yep. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep.
But you know what her nickname was?
Uh,
True story. Her nickname was Sarge.
Sarge?
Sarge as in
ordering
sergeant.
everybody around?
Because she bossed everybody around.
Yeah.
And so for the people who knew Joanne, they would just sort of ignore it,
Right.
One day we had a family came to our church. They volunteered to help with hospitality. A month or two later, they're leaving the church. I did like an exit interview. I go, hey, what's going on? Why are you leaving? Oh, give me some sort of beating around the bush. I'm like, is there really something more than that? And the wife said to me, well, I volunteered in the kitchen and I really got hurt. I'm like, well, tell me about that, and she told me about how Joanne Sarge had corrected her and said, don't do that. And you stand, and embarrassed her in front of other people.
Right. Right.
So Mark,
Who's going to volunteer in that environment? Yeah.
who wants to volunteer in that environment?
Yeah.
So I had to confront Joanne.
Mm-hmm.
And I brought her in my office, said, Joanne, I love you. You are incredible putting together meals. But guess what?
Mm-hmm.
Just like Mary and Martha,
Mm-hmm.
relationships are more important than radishes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, I would rather have you sitting at the feet of Jesus, and I would rather have you engaging people in the kitchen than have this polished, perfect meal for everybody.
Right.
And if you cannot do that,
Yeah.
then I'm not sure you're going to be able to lead our hospitality moving forward. And within about 6 months, she agreed to step aside, and she didn't leave the church because we handled it very graciously. But you understand, if I did not confront that, Mark,
Right.
if I did not challenge her, she was still going to run over people, and it was going to hurt our church's ability to do ministry because while we had great meals, no one could volunteer, and people felt devalued or in some cases embarrassed or shamed because they weren't doing it the right way.
Yep. Yep. No, we had some of the same experiences in our years too. I remember we had a greeter, an older man who liked to pinch everybody. He would hold them too tight and pinch their bum. And eventually I heard about it. And I go, what? How long has he been doing it? He's been back there and nobody's said a word. Of course, Mark got elected to go talk to him. But he was the sweetest man. He just had an issue with what his hands were doing. And that was not a good impression on visitors. Although the people who were in the family, they said, oh, that's just him. We can't put up with that. So we had a discussion. And that was hard. The other hard one for me was at a church where they had an LGBTQ or STUV, I call them, board member. And the family was this beautiful family part of the church, but he became a board member, and he was a flaming board member, I got to say. And we love these people, but why are they in leadership on the board of our church? And I had to address that. And that's a hard thing.
Mm.
What do you say? You say, I love you, but I can't have you in leadership.
Yeah.
I still want you to be part of it, as in all of these. And I want you to be part of this church, but you can't be in leadership. Much like when we select preschool teachers and people even to clean the bathrooms, that they have to have character. They have to not be putting the church or themselves and the kingdom in a bad situation. Those are the hardest ones, but yet what I found, again, I came from the business world, and it isn't that when you had a decision, you could say, well, this is just business, but in church, our business is to love people. And so a lot of times we don't confront, and we don't actually, we leave a staff person too long.
Yes.
We leave a pastor too long at the helm when we all love him, but it's not helping the church. We leave people in positions that they shouldn't be in those. And yet the most loving thing to do sometimes is to let people know and let people go and let them know you love them. And,
so two things I'd say about that, 100% correct, is that, first of all, remember the story of the rich young ruler.
Oh, yeah.
And he says, I'll do whatever I want to do, this and that. But Jesus said, if you really want to follow me, go sell your possessions, give the poor. Now, here's the important thing. The Bible says the man walked away very sad.
Yeah.
But Jesus let him walk away.
Yep.
And sometimes we have to confront people with hard things.
Example.
And even though they may be upset or they may be sad, sometimes it's just the way it is. But by not addressing those things, you're already addressing them. And you're saying this is okay. And those things are shaping the culture of your church.
Absolutely.
The other thing I would say is that, to your point when you were talking, John Ortberg had a famous saying from several years ago. I don't remember what book it was, but he said, too many churches are dying due to terminal niceness.
Terminal niceness. Oh,
terminal niceness.
Mm-hmm.
Because we think that we're being loving and we're actually hurting ourselves. We're limiting the kingdom because we think loving is being nice. Mm-hmm. Sometimes loving means, one of my life verses is Ephesians chapter 4, speak the truth in love.
Yes.
We have to, and one of the mantras I use with my staff and every church I've been in is, we are going to lead with compassion and candor.
And candor.
We have to be able to say what needs to be said. We need to be able to confront things. We have to be able to do that, but we're going to do so with compassion.
Yeah.
And so, and like I said, not everyone's going to take it that way. Some people get mad. Some people leave the church. Some people accuse you of being on a power trip. But my guess is every person that's listening to us right now, Mark, they all can identify people or situations in their church that they know is not healthy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we just sort of let it go. We kick the can down the road, hoping it's going to get better. And as you know, hope is not a strategy. No. Sometimes you have to confront things. And I believe the biblical model is, and Jesus modeled it, the apostles modeled it. Sometimes you have to confront things.
Yep.
And we have to confront it in love, but we have to confront it because otherwise, and especially in small churches, here's the phrase I always tell churches, especially small churches of under 200 people. They give disproportionate power to spiritually immature people. Right? Because what happens is that we shrink the culture of our church down to the most unhealthy people, because in a church of 150 or 200 people and smaller, you're what we call a single cell church. You're one big family.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when you have unhealthy people that are really dysfunctional, it affects the whole family, the whole dynamic. Yeah. And like I said, I'm not saying you kick people out. I'm saying you have to have the difficult conversations. You've got to confront the greeter who's pinching people in the butt and say, listen, I understand for you and your friends, that's fun. I get it. I have a sense of humor, but some people are offended by this, and it's a different world than it was 20 years ago. And we have visitors who don't know you, or, the children's worker who's not friendly to the kids, or, we can just go on and on and on, but you have to confront these things. The people, listen, Mark, my first month here in Palm West, I had to confront the idea of saving seats. I had been here 1 month.
1 month, and that's all you got?
And I got up on a Sunday morning. I wrote my newsletter article. I got up on a Sunday morning. I said, listen, I know you guys like holding on to your seats, but listen, it's a bad message to visitors, and we need to move beyond this. And if you want to save a seat, you get here earlier and you sit in your seat, but you're not going to come down here and throw down sweaters and bulletins and everything else and save all the end seats.
Oh, wow.
So people, and you know what? A couple people got their nose bent, but 95% of our people said, you know what, Jim, you're right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But But
You
if you don't
addressed it.
confront it, nothing changes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, these are great messages. But let's turn the corner and do some positives here as we're closing out. There's churches that have a lot of strengths in their culture. Maybe
Absolutely.
they recognize them, maybe they don't. But how did they leverage those strengths now to actually help the church and to really be the soil that can be planted so the fruit can really grow?
Well, so I think first of all, when you have healthy elements of your culture,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's people, ministries, environments, you celebrate it.
Mm.
Um, if you have a property team that does a great job,
Yeah.
and as a pastor, if I drive in and I see the flowers look good and the yard's manicured and trimmed up, don't be afraid to say something.
Yes.
When you see people that are setting an example of the kind of culture that you want to develop, you
Mm.
celebrate those people.
Yes.
And you say, hey, I just got to say something here. Let me just tell you about Mark. What a
Mm.
great job he does. I see Mark out there greeting. You celebrate that. You have a prayer team full of intercessors that pray
Uh-huh.
quietly and humbly behind closed doors. Celebrate that. So when you see elements of your culture being modeled the way you want, whether by people or by ministries,
Yes.
you give them, you positively mention them,
Yes.
because by positively celebrating the people that are doing it right,
Mm-hmm.
you're giving a vision to the people that are not.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And you've probably heard me share this story, Mark, but when we transitioned at the church I was at before this one, we went from very traditional worship to a very modern, like there's traditional, there's
Yeah.
contemporary, and there's
And then
more
there's
modern worship. And
very
we
modern.
made a big jump.
Yeah.
We had a church leader at the time, was in his late 80s. His name was Gene. And
Uh,
Gene was in his mid to late 80s. He was a board member. And we were talking about the music. And Gene said, I don't like the music. I cannot stand it. He goes, matter of fact, I even wear earplugs because it's too loud for me.
uh,
He said, but you know what I do? I love seeing people with kids in service. I love
oh,
seeing parents rocking their children to the music, everything
yeah.
else.
Yeah.
And you know what I did? I made that guy a hero. I used him in sermon illustrations. I shared
Uh-huh.
about him because he was an
Uh-huh.
example of a guy who said, I don't like this, but I love seeing people come to Christ more than I love what I like.
What a
And
great line.
so
What a
I
great
you
line.
make a hero out of Gene.
Yeah.
And the squeaky wheel, you don't always give the oil to.
Yep.
Sometimes you just say, but if the squeaky wheel always gets the oil, all you're doing is inviting more people to complain about stuff.
Yep. Yep. It's true.
So
Yeah.
celebrate your wins. That's the main thing I would say to you. Write about it in your newsletter article. Celebrate it on a Sunday morning, but lift up those people that you feel like are modeling the culture that you want to
Yeah.
develop.
Oh, that's
The
great.
other thing is, this is very important, is is when you have new people that come into your church that you feel like are embracing the culture you want to develop. Don't be afraid to get those people involved,
Yeah.
because you got to have a combination of, you've got to have existing people that are willing to sort of model the culture,
Mm-hmm.
and then you've got to bring in some fresh blood sometimes. And
Mm-hmm.
you don't want to give people a platform too quickly until you know who they are and what they're, because sometimes people look really good the first 3 months and you realize
Yeah.
they had an agenda.
Yeah.
But don't be afraid to onboard people and into positions that are going to be able to influence the church culture.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, you got to be really careful with that, don't you? I've seen a lot of churches that as soon as they got a new believer, they baptize them. They're part of the church. They just joined. All of a sudden, they're on a board. I'm going, really?
Yeah.
They're going to see so much, if I can say it, too much negativity and too much behind the scenes too fast. That can wipe out the excitement of being a new Christian if you don't have the maturity yet to sit in those meetings and to deal with some of the conflict and deal with some of the things behind the
Yeah.
scenes. So important that we do it in a timely manner, allow people to have
Yeah.
that place to develop, but not that's right out front that really hurts them and the church.
Yeah. So it's like I said, you got to be careful there, but at the same time, sometimes you feel like, well, we got to wait 2 or 3 years to get them involved. No, you've got to use
Uh-huh.
those people, try to get them engaged to influence culture.
Uh-huh.
The other thing I would say is this, is when it comes to ministries and programs,
Uh-huh.
you have to feed what's working.
Oh.
And you have to, I think it's Rick Warren who said one time, if the horse is dead, dismount.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
once again, when we have
Uh,
programs that are dying, but they still insist on having financial resources and
mm,
everything else, that also affects culture,
yeah.
because you're draining resources and time and energy to something that's not working.
Yeah.
So you've got to be willing to sometimes eliminate programs and eliminate ministries, even though they
Yeah.
had a great run back in the day.
Yeah.
It's a new day,
Mm-hmm.
and then when you have programs and ministries that are working and modeling the culture you want, you've got to
Mm-hmm.
celebrate those and feed those. um, but those
Yeah.
are just a few things you do, but
Yeah.
because
That's
it's
great.
not easy to do. But I guarantee you, when you start celebrating the people and ministries that are modeling the culture you want, other
Yeah.
people will see that and take note. And then
Yeah.
you have to address programs, ministries,
Mm.
facilities, and people that are hurting your culture.
Yeah. That's just such great stuff, Jim. I so appreciate you being here. Hey, one thing I haven't done well today here is ask our participants if they have any questions. So let me just stop for a minute, and if you have a question that you really want to ask, uh, here we go from Glenn. This is all great. I've been there, done that. But what about upstream? Upstream is modeling by pastor and board expectations about control and freedom, participation versus upfront leadership. Get upstream right, it makes downstream a whole lot easier. Not. Oh, I see what you mean. So upstream is just as important as what you're saying, Glenn. You want to address that at all, Jim?
Well, 100% is what we said earlier. If
Yeah.
you're if
Yeah.
you're if you're cracked at the top, you're split at the bottom.
Exactly.
So yes, you've got to, and you've got to influence
Mm.
sometimes you have unhealthy leaders or board
Mm.
members or staff members, and you have people in the church that see that. All you can do is you can try to, even as a layperson, you sometimes you have to confront those situations. You have to say,
Yeah.
I'm not sure this board member or this person is really helping the church, and
Uh-huh.
you've got to have the conversation.
Yeah.
And so 100% correct. It's not just top down, it's also bottom up.
Yeah. And I would say in your church staff too, all of your boards and leaders, they all have to be on that same page in unity of where you want to go, where you've been, confronting those things, and actually being the positive force, so that the upstream is always everybody together, upstream together. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah. And
um,
I'll say this, the other thing um, to Glenn's point is that, we all know this, but actions speak louder than words.
uh-huh.
And if your leaders have to embody the culture that you want to have, and so you've got to say, do we want a welcoming environment?
Mm-hmm.
Do we want a worshiping environment? Do we want a prayer environment? When you have an idea of what kind of culture you want to have, you've got to have it modeled.
Mm.
If the pastor is talking about the importance of prayer, but he's not showing up to any of the prayer gatherings, right? If you say we want to have a church that's reaching lost people for Christ, and none of your leaders are inviting people to church,
Yeah.
right? And I
Yeah.
mean, just to give an example of that, the best thing I did for evangelism in the
Mm.
past is that when I would bring somebody to church, when I would invite someone to church,
Yeah.
and people knew that they were invited by the pastor, it's better than any sermon I could say. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Because people see you modeling that, they see
You're
you living
doing
that
what
out.
you. Yeah.
And so you have to embody the culture you want at the top, because
Yeah.
you can say all the right things, but if you're not modeling it, people will see through it.
You gave a quote in the back of your book in Final Thoughts by St. Francis, and I just think goes so well here. I have done what was mine to do. Now you must do what is yours to do. And you even followed it with a verse here out of the Psalms, 107:37-38. They sowed fields and planted vineyards that yielded a fruitful harvest. He blessed them, and their numbers greatly increased. And he did not let their herds diminish. And of course, they were in an agricultural
Right.
kind of a environment, but so important that what we say and what we do match up, and God will bless it. And it's so obvious in our churches. I want to give time. I don't see any other questions, but any final words, Jim, that you'd like to lay on us here, so that this stays with us? Anything else that we missed, or you'd want to add?
No, I think that's a lot to cover. There's a lot more details that we can talk about.
Yeah. Yeah.
The only other thing I would say is that, all of us as leaders, we're all fallen,
Yeah.
right? And so I think that we have to, you cannot change what you don't acknowledge is broken.
Yeah.
And so if we can do any number of things, but we have to be able to own it. And if our church culture is waning and we know it, especially leaders, board members, you have to graciously acknowledge that. You have to say, listen, this is just not working, or this is what we think we're doing well, and we want to build on this.
Yeah.
But when you're not functioning in a healthy way, if your culture is more discouraging or maybe even toxic, you have to own that, and then you have to try to redo it. The other thing I would say is this. This is very, very, very important. Culture is one of those things. It's a lot like momentum in sports.
Yes.
You can lose it in one game,
Yep.
one period, one play. You can lose momentum, and just the whole air leaves the stadium. It's very hard to build it, but when you build it, man, you're rolling. But you can lose it a heck of a lot quicker than you can build it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the same way with culture. I think it may have been Peter Drucker who said that it takes at least 2 to 5 years to change a culture of an organization.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Because once again, I can change music next week. I can change staff members in a month. I can paint the building. But when it comes to changing the environment, the attitudes, the beliefs, the characteristics of our congregation, that takes time to change behaviors. And so if you have a culture that is maybe struggling, understand that it's a slow process.
Yeah, just doesn't happen overnight. Yeah.
Yes, exactly right.
For the long haul, don't expect change immediately, but start on change immediately from your first day and stay at it. Well, Jim, I want to thank you for being here today. This has been so insightful. I know a lot of folks here have stayed with us this whole time. I just want to read one quote for us out of your book on page 27 of Dirt Matters. And I'll just remind you, if you don't have this book, this is the best book I've read on church culture and how to change it, what it is. You ought to get your hands on this. He says on page 27, if we change the soil, resurrections can happen. Languishing, struggling, and dying churches can be turned around, brought back to life. They can even go places they've never gone before. But it's not easy. It's a process, and it takes commitment. And I would say that's what we're talking about here, developing a foundation for a healthy, vibrant church for the future, for the kingdom. I want to remind you today, there is another webinar from our church health team on Tuesday, June 28th at 1 p.m. We're going to have a few folks, I think Larry Onan, Jim Powell, and Ray Bennett will be talking about 5 types of church boards and the pros and cons of each and some practices that might work on a church board to help. And I see that hand before we end. Jim, you had one more comment?
I have one more important thing to say. So Glenn, Ivan, Sylvia, you guys are still in line with this. Thank you for staying with us. If there's anything else I can do to help you, feel free to send me an email or call. Yes, but otherwise, I also want to say this. You guys might not be aware, but today's Mark's last day as he retires here from TM. And Mark has been a tremendous blessing to this organization. Oh, and he's been an encouragement to me personally. The first time I met Mark, I was not a TM pastor. I was speaking at the Mustard Seed Conference. And I really fell in love with him and Willie and all the people there that I met through TM. And as we've worked with Mark the last 3 years, he was helped me get placed here at this particular church. Yeah. Let me just say congratulations to you on a good run. We know God's not done with you yet, that there's going to be something around the corner in a new season of life. But bless you in your retirement, and thank you for all you've done for the kingdom of God and for the TM churches.
Well, thank you, Jim, for ending this webinar and my last webinar here at TM, at least for a time. We'll see what God has for a season. For now, I'm doing what I've helped churches the last 5.5 years, is to get healthy. That's my job now. And so I'm going to work on that, and I know we'll be talking to many of you in the future. Thank you for those kind words. And I'll look forward to seeing all of you in some of these webinars down the road. I've set up Kirk Mackey and Peter Torrey will be leading the church health team, and I'll be in the background doing a little bit of consulting and helping here and there. But I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And we know that God's the one that does the renewal. Yes. Bless you each. Thank you for being here today. God bless.
Thank you so much. Like, all right, bye, everybody. See you, Mark. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.